also known as JB Font, and we are here on the JB Show, part of the Fred Hampton Leftist Network. And I have a very special and brilliant guest on today. His name is Kahmali Rose. Kamali Rose is a political commentator and host of the Radical Democracy Show. Kamali, how are you doing today? But I can actually assume that you're doing very well because that shirt is fire.
Thank you. Doing great, of course. Appreciate you having me on, James. Always enjoy, chatting with you and catching up with you and just discussing politics, news of the day with you. So, you are also a brilliant voice on the left, and so
Thank you.
an inspirational one as well. So, glad to be on here with you. Really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. Um, there was a couple of topics that we wanted to discuss, and I always like to, ask my guests when they come on, what do they want to discuss, and something that's of peak interest to them. One of the things, and that's of great interest to me as well, is that you wanted to discuss workplace democracy. Um, Now, I would like to get what your definition of workplace democracy is, and let's see if we can square that circle with what my definition of workplace democracy is.
Absolutely. So right now, we know that the way that most businesses run in here in the United States is, in any capitalist, system, is that you have a handful of people, the board of directors that are the decision makers, they're the employer, and they have all the decision making power in the company. It's usually the larger the company gets, the smaller, the more disproportionate that group is to the proportion of workers, the people that are actually there, doing the actual labor in a company. And that board of directors has all the decision making power. Who gets to work, where you work, when you work, how, what tools you use to work with, and what gets done with the surplus of your labor. And
Mhm.
so in a democratic workplace, some of the many times they're referred to as worker cooperatives or worker self-directed enterprises. The idea of workplace democracy, and the idea of democracy in general, is if something affects me directly, then I should have an equal say in determining the outcome of that. And so with workplace democracy, the idea is one worker, one vote on all major decisions, which are the decisions that are typically made by the employer class in a capitalist system. So, who gets to work, where we work, how we work, when we work, and what gets done with the surplus of our labor. That is all controlled democratically by the workers. So how that looks is it can be very different from one workplace to another in democratic workplaces. Many people have the idea that a democratic workplace means that everyone gets paid the same amount of money, and that's just not true. That's not the case. There are plenty of democratic workplaces, plenty of examples of workplace democracy where workers have a variation of wages. Some workplaces they get together and they decide, and the way that looks is, you come to work and you show up to work, say 4 days a week, and you do your regular duties, whatever you would normally do in the course of a day. And then maybe one day a week you get together and you have a meeting and you discuss the sort of broader issues and systems that you want to implement. And it can be one day a week, or it can be one day a month. And for some people, it's only one day a quarter that they get together and do this. So it's not strict in any way. It's really for those workers to decide what they're comfortable with, what works for them. And the idea is that allows people to self-determine, right? To have some sense of control over their own labor, and again, most importantly, the surplus of that labor. Because Marx was famous for recognizing what he really studied and recognized was that he looked at the surplus of labor in different economic systems, right? So who controls the surplus of labor? And what he found was that whoever controls the surplus of labor essentially controls society, really. And so
Definitely. Yeah.
in monarchies, we had kings and queens who controlled the surplus of labor. You had the kings and queens, and then all of the subjects within their kingdom, and the subjects in their kingdom would work, and the surplus of their labor would go to those kings and queens. In feudal systems, we had lords and serfs. The lords controlled the land, landlords, and the serfs worked that land. And 4 days a week the serfs would work that land for the lord, and whatever they produced in those 4 days would be given over to the lord of the land, and the additional 3 days was for them to work their own land for themselves and their families, right? So even under feudal systems, there was only a 4-day work week technically, right? The other 3 days was spent taking care of yourself and your family, right? And then under slavery, you had the master and the slave, and the master controlled pretty much 100% of the surplus of the slave's labor, but then they would still give to the slave enough food, clothing, and shelter, just enough for the slave to survive, right? Because they don't want that slave to die. They need that slave's labor, so they need that slave to be able to continue to survive. So now in capitalist systems, we have employer, employee, and the employer is the one that controls the surplus of your labor, makes all those decisions for you. And essentially what we have set up now is a system of wage slavery, is what Marx referred to it as. And what we're calling for in workplace democracy is for the actual a control of the means of production by the workers. So worker self-directed enterprises, or worker controlled enterprises, worker cooperatives. And so that we socialists, modern day socialists, or the 21st century socialists, now our belief is that we focused a little too much on the sort of macro systems in economics, and looking at things like focusing too much on, well, is it the state or private control over enterprises? And what we believe, as modern day socialists, is that is not as important whether it's the state or a private enterprise, really, so much as who is making the decisions on a day-to-day basis within those enterprises. And so the belief is that we need a democratic system. And really, how can a country like America, that prides itself on being a democratic country and spreading democracy all over the world, how can we even say that we do that when we don't even implement democracy in the place where the majority of adults spend the majority of their waking hours of their lives, either at the job, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and many more hours are spent either getting ready for that job or recuperating from that job. We have this thing called happy hour that happens at around 6 o'clock every day at bars around the country, and the reason they call it the happy hour is probably because they're understanding that the previous 8 hours were not so happy. So we spend a lot of time even just recuperating and recovering from the work that we do. And we believe that we would have a much fairer system where people were able to make those decisions without this authoritarian system where they're being sort of dictated to from above. And we believe that that's a much fairer system, and one that'll teach people how to actually participate in democracy, because we've sort of lost control over our political democracy at this point, because again, the people who control the surplus control the society, really. And so because these capitalists, this employer class controls the surplus of our labor right now, they use that surplus of our labor to do things like fund politicians, to donate to different politicians and different causes, and in order to control our society, really. And so the only way that we will ever take back control of our political democracy is if we first institute economic democracy.
That is a well fleshed out explanation, and I appreciate that. Um, and it definitely coincides with what my take on what workplace democracy is. Workplace democracy is exactly how it sounds. You have a say in what your employer does. And in a sense, you are also an entrepreneur within that system, because you also get to dictate. And your contribution to being an entrepreneur is the labor that you provide for that establishment. So therefore, you are a stakeholder just like everyone else. As,
Absolutely.
so as far as being a participant in workplace democracy. If people had workplace democracy, a lot of the especially manufacturing jobs wouldn't have been shipped overseas. Outsourcing would be a rarity if we had workplace democracy because a lot of these workers would not vote to have their jobs taken away.
It's tell me any set of workers that would ever get together and vote if everyone was given an equal say, a democratic vote in a decision like should we relocate our plant from Detroit. Look at what happened in Detroit, Michigan. Should
Hmm.
we relocate our plant in Detroit
Hmm.
to Mexico or to China? You give all
Hmm.
the workers a vote on that. Are the workers going to ship their jobs overseas when they don't all want to go move to Mexico or to China? Is there who believes, who here believes that those workers would collectively get together and decide to send their jobs to another country where, for the idea that you can exploit some cheaper labor over in some foreign country somewhere? Why would they want to do that when that means that they no longer have a job and have a means of supporting themselves and staying, having some sort of safety net for themselves? So no group of workers would ever get together collectively and agree to outsource their own jobs.
Yeah,
So I completely agree with you in that sense.
yeah. If we had workplace democracy, NAFTA, TPP, and what's the other one? The newest one that Obama wanted to implement. I forgot the name of it. But these trade deals would have never taken place. In fact, they would have been laughed at out of the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, what they call free trade is something that what we should be looking for is fair trade, not free trade, because free trade means it's free for capital, right? Because labor isn't able to move freely across borders, but capital
Hmm.
is, right? We
Hmm.
have all kinds of laws that keep people from migrating to our country. Look at what we're doing on our southern border right now. But
Hmm.
capital is allowed to flow freely between borders. And so
Yes.
the freedom is really for capital and not for the laborers or the workers.
Yeah. And so this is one of the reasons why socialism is decried upon capitalists because it's so labor intensive. Uh, what Gene commented said, yes, let's support the idea of international unions. This sounds like something that is great to me because I would love to see a union just for servers or a union just for retail workers, a retail workers union, or customer service reps union. So the thing is that when it comes to workplace democracy, it's also a means of saying, okay, so you guys want to keep us at a specific wage? No, we're not going to do that. This is what we all vote. It's unanimous. Okay, so we're going to all have a living wage? Perfect. This is what we vote on. And the thing is we should not accept, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that word. We should not accept totalitarianism in our workplace. That is
Absolutely.
that is unacceptable. If we accept totalitarianism at our workplace, then guess what? We're going to accept it in our government.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we've seen is that whatever systems exist within the economic system,
Hmm.
they replay themselves out inside of our political system. So, we've essentially existed under an oligarchic system here in our economic system, where the wealthiest people are the deciders and the decision makers, and
Hmm.
it's an authoritarian system, of course. And we've replayed that out inside of our political system, where we elect these leaders and
Hmm.
we give them this untold power over us to
Hmm.
make all these decisions, and we can see what happens. Whether the employer is a private employer or the state, you still end up with similar situations happening. Like, look what happened when Trump was president, and they didn't enact the budget, and hundreds of thousands of workers were
Hmm.
out of work for nearly a month. And so all those workers just were bumped off their job just like that. And so
Yeah.
whether the employer is the state or the employer is a private institution, as long as you have this employer-employee relationship, there's an inherent contradiction within that setup, where you have an inherent tension within that system, where the employer is always trying to extract as much labor for as little cost as possible from the worker, and the worker is constantly trying to extract as much benefits as they can from the employer, while giving up as little of their labor as possible, because people should be expected and allowed to have time for leisure. And more we see that even here in America, where we're considered so free and democratic, we work more hours on average than many other countries, because people are working these low-paying jobs and forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to stay afloat, especially with our pathetic minimum wage that we have in this country as well. And one little bit of pushback that I'll give on, and I don't even know if it's necessarily pushback, but sort of a counterpoint to your point about unions, is that I think I support unions in general. I support unions because I support any sort of labor power, of course.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the issues with unions is that they also operate in an essentially undemocratic way. Unfortunately, we still elect union leaders. It's still what most would recognize as a representative democracy, which is very similar to what we do in our political system, right? We elect representatives, and then we hope and we pray that those representatives will actually represent our best interests. And what we find all too often with unions is that they get way too comfortable with the capitalist class, and they will actually block things like strikes. Many of the strikes that have been effective in recent years have been wildcat strikes that go outside of the unions, that actually, like the teacher strikes that rose up in 2017 and 2018, were wildcat strikes operating outside of unions. And the solution that socialists have for the sort of collective operation in cooperative existence internationally is to build international collectives and international cooperatives where we are able to function all democratically still. One example of this is in Rojava in northern Syria. They are instituting a system known as democratic confederalism, and the idea there is each entity operates as a democratic workplace, but they also work together collectively and have a democratic decision-making process collectively as well. Now, there is some representational democracy within that, but it's at the base level, it is much more democratic, and there's much more democracy throughout the entire system as well. And with unions, with unions, you always run into this issue of, and it happens within our political system as well. When the fewer people that you have to have in control, it makes it easier to corrupt those individuals, right? All you have to do is to corrupt one individual, and then you can have control over hundreds or thousands of people at that point. And so with the more direct democracy we have, my belief is that you can't, in order to corrupt a system like direct democracy, right, that means that you have to do something where you essentially have to corrupt every single person within that system. And if you do that, well, then good for you. That means that you still are implementing the will of the people. If they want to be quote unquote corrupted by it in some way, you pay off every single person within a democracy. Well, that means that they see it as a better benefit to themselves. And so, so be it if they want to enact whatever policy you are trying to push for. But that's why I also, alongside workplace democracy, something that I often advocate for and always try to advocate for is collective cooperative economies as well, where we are making sure that we're still working together in a way that we don't have to all out compete against one another, and we can actually cooperate with one another. In the case of democratic confederalism, the way that plays out is that each of these democratic workplaces, they are required to contribute up to about 5% of their revenues to a collective fund, where that is then democratically decided on what gets done with that fund. It can be used for mutual aid. It can be used for, as a social safety net. It can be used as a strike fund to support striking workers. So in that, decision making is still done collectively and democratically as well. And so we can implement systems like that where people are still, each enterprise still has autonomy, because 95% of what you're earning is still decided over democratically by the people directly within that institution. But we are still, all of our successes contribute to the success of everyone within that system, and we don't have to see each other as competitors, but rather as, you know, cooperators in one, you know, global system, a cosmopolitan system, where we see each other as one global community, essentially.
Collaboration, yeah.
Exactly.
I want to clarify, to a socialist, unions are the lesser evil.
Yes.
Unions are the compromise. So that's what I should clarify. I want to make sure I clarify that. So having workplace democracy and workers basically owning the means of production is my ultimate goal. I want to get here to the chat because there are some questions here, and
Yep.
I
Yep.
think it'd
Let's
be
do it.
great for us to answer.
Yes. Let's do it.
Let's see. QKR Socialist presented a question. He said, "How can we promote and discuss workplace co-ops more easily? A hashtag, a Discord channel on FHL. Professor Wolf teaches that there are so many models. How can we discuss options?" Um, First of all, as far as a Discord channel, if you go to our Patreon, we actually have the access to our Discord there. So we do have a Discord, just letting you know. And promoting and discussing workplace co-ops, we're doing it right now.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be just Kahmali and myself or anybody else that has a camera and a microphone. Workplace co-ops need to be discussed with pretty much anybody you come in contact with that is a worker.
Yeah.
Anyone. I don't care if they make six figures a year. You talk about workplace co-ops with them.
That's what
And
I was I was working in as a software engineer, with, you know, making six figures, and I was out there, you know, talking about workplace democracy within the workplace.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so with that, QKR Socialist, um, the moment you hear somebody complain about their job, because everybody does, we all complain. It's going to happen. You can throw a rock and you'll hit somebody who complains about their job. The moment you find somebody who does that, you bring up, man, this is why people need to be able to have a say in their workplace. It should be there should be democracy in the workplace. And if you get someone who talks against that, it's easy to push back on them because it go, so you're against democracy in the workplace?
Boom.
And
Yes.
then watch
Exactly.
them twist themselves into a pretzel on that one,
Yeah.
right? Because now you basically have to advocate for a dictatorship or totalitarian rule within the workplace.
Yep. Yep.
And
Absolutely.
how does that make you sound? And all
Absolutely.
you need to do is ask questions. Just ask questions. That's all you need to do. Just keep asking questions, and then watch and grab some popcorn while you do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The like you said, the question is, do you believe in democracy? And that's the jumping off point is, do you believe in democracy? And if you truly believe in democracy, why do we ban democracy in the place where the majority of adults are spending the majority of the waking hours of their lives? Why would we support democracy, but not in the place where we're all spending most of our time? That doesn't sound like true support over democracy. And I would say that, you know, it has to go beyond social media as well. Of course, we should absolutely use social media as a platform. Social media is what helped things like the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, gain prominence in the United States and around the world, really. And so we shouldn't ignore social media. We should absolutely use social media, but we also need to support organizations that are supportive of workplace democracy. Try to seek out, institutions that are operating as worker cooperatives, and patronize those places, like buy and use services from those places as well. But also, we have to do the work ourselves wherever we exist, wherever we are working. to begin to radicalize our coworkers in this way, and to try to institute workplace democracy wherever it is that we exist, right? So that's what we're doing at the Radical Democracy Show. We operate democratically. We are absolutely committed to developing a democratic workplace, one worker, one vote on all major decisions. And so it's about actually instituting it right where we are. And so it absolutely can, social media is an important part of it. I think that using social media to talk about it in any way that you can is absolutely a good idea. But I think that we have to also go beyond that and start to just build it. A great example that I'll give is Mondragon, right? There's a place in the Basque region of Spain, and it is it's called, there's a place there called a company there called Mondragon. And Mondragon was developed, it started 60 years ago now. And 60 years ago, it was started by a priest, Father Arizmendi, Jose Arizmendi. And it was founded in 1956. And it started with 5 people. This one priest and 5 other people, he got together and he started this company. And in that time, and he developed it as a democratic workplace. And since then, since starting this democratic workplace with 6 people, by 2019, there were over 80,000 people were employed by Mondragon cooperatives. All of those institutions operating as democratic workplaces, and together making up a federation of worker cooperatives known as the Mondragon Corporation. That corporation is now the 7th largest company in Spain, and companies like General Electric, Microsoft, they send people over to Mondragon to learn how to be as productive as those institutions are. So to anybody that believes that, we'll lose productivity if we have, democracy is so slow, and it's a difficult process and it's very slow. Well, they've actually found that workers are more productive in enterprises where they have control over their labor. And of course, why wouldn't you? When I was an entrepreneur, I was originally a software engineer. I developed a platform known as Nimble Notes. You can go right now, nimblenotes.com. It's an online note-taking and study platform for students. And I was an entrepreneur. I was able to build that thing and found it. And I dedicated all the time that I had to that because I felt ownership over it. Of course, I felt connected to it and felt responsible for it in a way, because I didn't feel alienated from it the way that capitalism alienates us from our work, right? We go to work, we show up at work, we produce, we produce these goods and services. And then at the end of the day, whatever we've produced, the employer says, you leave that here. And if you dare to take that home, they send some folks to your house with some blue outfits on, some blue uniforms and some billy clubs and some guns. And they'll send them to your house and take that back from you forcefully if you dare to take home the means of production. So those are known as cops here. And so we definitely, people can see it's almost obvious why people would be more productive in those systems. But that started as 6 people 60 years ago, and now it employs over 80,000 people. Imagine if we did 100 of those, right? If we could build 100 of those kind of worker cooperatives across the country, then, and trust me, they exist right now. There are worker cooperatives all across the United States, and some large companies that people know, like Land O'Lakes, that actually operate as technically a farmer-owned cooperative. They're not as democratic as a true worker cooperative in that sense, but they do operate as farmer owned, and so worker owned institutions. So so I would just use Mondragon as an example of how we can actually, it doesn't even require so much, the social media aspect of it isn't as important as the actual development of these institutions, because by developing these institutions, now Mondragon has their own university, they have their own, security forces, their own police forces. So, and they can all democratically decide over how those things operate, right? So, and we send people from, these major institutions, send people to these universities to learn how to be as productive as these institutions. So I would just urge people to also look at how we just start to build it ourselves and not wait around for a hashtag or anything like that. We can do it right now where we are, where we work, and just by building it up. It might only be a handful of people to start with, but we can, that handful of people 50 years from now, imagine if we have 100 of these things, that's 100, that's 8 million people covered under workplace democracy and in a cooperative collective enterprises. And so I don't think we even need to wait around for a big social media push or anything like that. We just got to start instituting it wherever we exist, wherever we are, especially in these spaces where we have a lot of control, right? Fred Hampton Leftists, they have total control over their institution right now. Like you all control that totally. You don't have any employer class over you that has to dictate down to you. So right at Fred Hampton Leftists, we can start institutions like that. Within Radical Democracy Show, we build institutions like that, and we start to work together collectively and cooperatively and grow in that sense. And so I think that's the real sort of push that we need to make, and the real way to develop workplace democracy is to just show people that we lead by example, essentially, right? Just show them that we can do it by doing it ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to respond to Pro Center in the comments, and he says Mondragon is not the paragon of socialist democracy y'all seem to think it is, and you know what, that may be true, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we have right now.
Absolutely.
And so to decry something that is much better than what we have right now as on the right direction, uh, you know, what would you? It's like, what would you rather have right now? A totalitarian job, which basically 99% of Americans already have, or something where they actually have voting power over what they can do. I understand that nothing is perfect, but at the same time, nothing is perfect. No system is perfect. Not socialism is not perfect, but at least it's something that we can implement to be better, way better than what we have. And it's not a lesser of two evils. It's something that is far and above better than what we have now. You know what I mean?
Yep. And 2 points on that. One point I'll give just as an example of why it's such a better system. Here in the US, we have, under our capitalist system that we have, our capitalist economic system, we have something like they review the pay disparity between CEOs, the people, what is the pay disparity within any one institution, right? Between the highest paid worker and the lowest paid or average pay of a worker, right? And in the United States, at some of our largest corporations, that proportion tends to be something like about 300 to 1 at this point. So the highest paid person is getting paid about 300 times more than the average pay or lowest paid worker, right? And so it's about 300 to 1. In Mondragon, it's 8 to 1. That is the largest proportion of in any one of those institutions. In some of the places, and they set the rule in each different enterprise, they set a rule that says what is the maximum that any one person can make more than another person. In some cooperatives there, it's 1 to 1. Every person makes the same. And I can make the argument for why every job should have the same pay. And I won't make that argument here. It takes a long time, but I can certainly make the argument for it. But it's 8 to 1 in Mondragon. So that's just one point of how it's so significantly better than what we have now. The second point that I'll make is just that what they're pointing out there, that viewer is pointing out, is actually a logical fallacy. And so what it's known as is the nirvana fallacy. And if you look up, I urge you to look up whoever it was that made that comment, look up the nirvana fallacy, and you'll see that you're falling into that same trap where it's the idea that, well, if your solution isn't perfect, then we shouldn't even bother trying anything, right? And so it's absolutely a fallacy to fall into that trap.
Okay, hold on. Pro Center. Okay, so I'm gonna put this on screen, and I'm gonna rebut this. He says Mondragon operates within the capitalist state, and Spain is a member of the U.S. imperialist and NATO alliance. I'm going to be as respectful as I can. Obviously, and the thing is that anything we do is going to operate within a capitalist state until we change it. But what we're doing by having workplace democracy is we're planting the seeds of socialism within the workplace. Because if you have workplace democracy, which people spend most of their lives at work, a huge majority of America, the majority of Americans spend their lives at work, and they spend most of their time at work. If we can get them to a point where they have workplace democracy, then they start to think more democratically, and then we can also start having workers owning the means of production. And if that's the case, then that is a step in the right direction. We How many socialist countries are there? Very little. So why in the hell would we try to just move to a socialist country in order to enact socialist policies when we're trying to make it here? The thing is, the United States is definitely pretty much the worst country in the world, but at the same time, we're doing our best to change that. And by changing it, we do our best by enacting socialist policies on the ground. Instead of going from the top down, we're going from the bottom up. And part of
Absolutely.
that is through workers because they are the ones who hold the power. And if
Absolutely.
we let them know that they have the power through a workplace democracy, then guess what? From the bottom up, it's going to change.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
I understand that you're trying what you're trying to say, but the thing is, and yeah, co-ops. You say co-ops are cool, but it's not enough on its own to make a revolution, of course. But at the same time, over time, if you have co-ops, that's workplace democracy, and the whole idea behind income inequality it gets taken down. Um, Institutional racism when it comes to hiring can be affected and diminished. And ultimately, it leads to the income inequality that we have between the super wealthy and the average worker. The gap will shrink. So
Absolutely.
ultimately, it does lead to that. But the thing is that it's not necessarily us banging on the doors of politicians and tearing them out of their houses and beating them up on the street.
Yep. And and, and
No.
and that was perfectly said. And I would even and to bolster your points there, I would one ask that person, how did capitalism come about? Capitalism is now the dominant economic system across the world, right? How did capitalism arise in the wake of feudalism? Well, I'll tell you how. All right. What happened was little experiments in capitalism started to pop up all around the world. All right, and some of them were crushed by the feudal lords. Right, some of them
Hmm.
were crushed, but some of them survived, and they started to grow. Right, and that's exactly how it grew and grew until it then started to dominate the system. So look at how capitalism came about. Just look at the history of any economic system that came about. In fact,
Yeah.
look at how it existed, how it came about within and under, under slavery, under feudalism, even through monarchical system, how feudalism arose. Again, it was through small experiments in new economic systems that began to grow, and of course some of them were crushed by the dominant economic system of the time, but some of them weren't. All right, and that's exactly how we had merchants under feudal system. We started with merchants, and these merchants began building up their capitalist, institutions and enterprises, and then those grew and grew into the point that they then took over and took control. Right, so we can use the same pattern to enact socialism. Right, we start with these small experiments in it, and we grow those. Right, and the some of them will be crushed naturally. The capitalist system, they're going to come in and they're going to try to dominate, they're going to try to crush us, but
Hmm.
some will survive. All right, Mondragon has survived for over 60 years. Look at the Emilia Romagna region of Italy. All right, how it has flourished. It is now 1/3 of the GDP for that region of Italy. All right,
Wow.
and they have a rule known as the Marcora law that says that whenever if you become unemployed and you can find 9 other unemployed people to get together with you, and you all agree to develop a democratic workplace, then instead of you collecting your weekly unemployment check like we do here in the United States, you can instead decide to get a one-time upfront payment of all of that for all 10 of you, and use that as the capital to begin a democratic workplace. And that has
Wow.
allowed workplace democracy to flourish in that region of Italy. And so imagine if we had laws like that. That's why, I'll support politicians that support laws like that, but we don't see that is so far out of the American psyche that I don't know of one single politician that has advocated for a Marcora law or something similar to it. And so,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. So, so I would just, urge people to look at how capitalism actually grew and came about, because it wasn't by some sort of violent revolution or anything like that, that capitalism came into place, around the world. It was through these small experiments, and we only see the violent revolution in the case of in the response to slavery, really.